living organisms. And the key is, it's not just a bacteria or a fungi or something, it's a combination of all of them, all working simultaneously together, which is really good. And the nice thing of the vital soil that you're going to talk about is its ability to accommodate everything. So if you look at that, nature knows more than 1,000,000 Einsteins, some say more than a teenager. So why do you try and control it? Why try and control it instead of working with it? I think that's the key point is, let's stop trying to control and work as much as possible with nature. Nature's free for free. Let's get all that back. And this is quite an interesting thing. So that was 1963, now 2003. That's arrow shows the same mountain. It's a bit dark in here, but that's what can be achieved. We can, if we're there, we can get back to there. At the same time, they were probably there and they went to there. So which direction are you going? We've got to start heading in that direction. So anything we can do, and it's also cumulative in effect. You don't have sort of, let's say you're going to go all biological next year, point your crop, you're probably going to go bust. Because of the balances on there. So it's progressively building up those soils. Okay, this, I'll put in this, that's basically where we look at the above ground plants. Below ground, you can see a whole lot of different reactions taking place. Try and read those, don't worry too much about it. You put it diagrammatically, that's the type of thing we put in our soils. That's a healthy soil. All those working together, interacting, improving growth, nutrient availability, and same thing. And that's where we're focusing. All these goodies here, as we get them going, that's where you start getting your performance. Going off to something which we can sort of visualize more easily, it's a starfish experiment done in a marine environment where they identified 15 species and they monitored them. They then took the starfish out of that environment, and only 8 species remain. We need to start replacing those starfish into our soils to get that biological process going, to get the free everything we start getting with it. Now, if you look at still in the ocean reefs, on average, have about 25 times more fish. Why? That's already. And the key to that is, first of all, refuge. If you look at this reef here, those small fish have a lot of places to hide, get away from the predators, so they can reach adulthood. You've also got an abundance of food within that reef, so that while they hide, they can still feed. And then you've got diversity and symbiosis. All those fish and algae and corals and everything, all working together in that environment to flourish. So what we're trying to say is, how can you create biological reefs in your soil? And that's what we're doing with the vital soil. So if we look at that, a bit of a tricky, there's the first photograph there is of biochar, difficult to see here, but in 1 gram of biochar, you're getting about 250 square meters of surface area. So you can imagine, you're looking at millions and millions of microbes could take refuge in that biochar. Now, if you only put the biochar down, the microbes there would not have a food source. So if you look at highly decomposed electroquine sawdust, which Murray came along with, very high in humates, that is now a source of the biochar. So that the microbes are there. But again, if you've got those two, but you don't have any microbes, again, it's not being much use. So then you're looking at vermicasts and cultured microbes. So you're inoculating that medium, which can now hold a lot of microbes. And with that cultured microbes, which are, in the case, products like from microbial solutions, which have been bred to be tolerant of chemicals and heat. So they can tolerate the agrochemicals we find in the land, and they become, to a large extent, the starfish. We replace the starfish together with the vermicast. And also what you have is you have an abundance of natural microbes sitting in the soil, which often need these symbiotic relationships to actually get activated. So you look at the sleeping beauties. Most soil microorganisms are in a dormant state waiting. We put it with the vital soils, with the other microbes, which help wake up the sleeping beauties and get them active in the soils. Okay, if we look at, I go to mycorrhiza because this to me is the most important microbe in the soil. It's in all of our soils and in many different types of mycorrhiza, and they link between different plant species and different mycorrhiza and into the same plant. And the mycorrhiza then links up with this other soil biology, different bacteria. It works like an internet highway. So if you look at, in 1 square meter of a highly biologically active soil, you have about 10,000 kilometers of height. They are a tenth of the thickness of a rooting. They can burrow where others can't go, and they can spread for up to 70 meters. And in that spreading 70 meters, they're linking a lot of plants. If you go to a diverse pasture, they can link many different species, which all work together. So you've got a two-way transport. It's like a highway, a telecommunications network, where nutrients can move up and down, as well as things like water. It helps with warning of attack. So if a plant over there by the door is attacked, chemicals going through the mycorrhiza give a warning of the attack, and the plants activate their immune systems. So we getting the plant to activate. If I digress here, if you look at especially diseases, there are very few diseases which actually manifest before crop set, fruit set, whatever. And the reason for that, the best analogy I've got is if you've got a lot of women working in the land, some with babies on the back, some with not, and the lion comes along, who's going to get attacked? It's one of the babies. So the plant has its baby, and it will sacrifice itself at the expense of the baby. So as it starts being put under stress by yield, its ability to fight off disease deteriorates. If we can change that and we can get the plant's immune system regulated, get a better nutrient balance and better water availability, that ability to fight off disease is increased. And then, as I mentioned, it links different species together, and those different species, for an example of Fairfield dairy, we try to grow maize without herbicide on an established pasture, rye, lucerne and clover. They grazed it flat, they went in zero till, and up to about knee height it was a mess. It was like weeds all over the place, and the maize started growing ahead of it and shading out the lucerne and the clover and the ryegrass. But when you got into that crop when it was fully grown, there's still the clover and the lucerne that all actively growing in that canopy. And the way I look at it, by linking it with the mycorrhiza, the legumes were feeding the maize nitrogen in exchange for sugar. So they didn't need to photosynthesize in that canopy. And that, I think, is a big group. We're not going to talk so much about cover crops and multi-species pasture, but that's where these mycorrhiza become very important. The next is a product called Glowen. It's a glue secreted by mycorrhiza, and that causes the clay particles to stick to you, that crumb structure. You get the crumb structure, your water holding capacity increases, your air porosity increases, so that all soil becomes a sponge instead of a rock. Then, if you're looking at 10,000 kilometers of high feed, mycorrhiza can hold 4 times its weight in water. If you compare that to the soil, it can probably hold about 20%. So by getting that whole biology going, your water holding capacity starts increasing as for higher organic soils with a much higher water holding capacity. If we, in our endeavors to reduce invasive crops, in our ignorance, we to a large extent negated or ignored some of the benefits. It doesn't mean to say we can grow without chemicals and stuff, but if we can start reducing the chemical usage, this whole thing starts coming back to life and you can start getting those benefits. This is an example here. We looked at this probably about a month ago in the the land. That was the root system of the treated plant. That was the untreated. We went back yesterday to have a relook to make sure it wasn't as big, but you still had bigger roots. So this is, we've chosen plants roughly the same size, similar crops, and that's what came out. But we've got other, this is on an extreme case, for those who don't know, it's on a center pivot, on a virgin land, Eskom didn't connect electricity, and this is a potentially a large rainfall area. So you're putting that crop with a high population under high stress. So this was what starts happening. You won't get this all the time, but it shows what's possible when the shit hits the fan, so to speak. Okay. The next one, this is at Grassy Park in Camberg. Here we look at a farm that does our organic soil, but in high rainfall. And you can see there's a fairly noticeable difference between root growth. And then we went to butt farming. Butt have got almost perfect soils, high organic, high rainfall. People see untreated, treated once, not a big difference. There were more smaller roots than that. And then we noticed a bigger response on the double treatment we have in the trial. So even in those ideal conditions, you are getting better root systems. If we now look at getting, this is work done in Australia from not so much cropping, this was holistic plan grazing and savory type concept. That has been grazed, plan grazed for 10 years, and that was across the fence line conventional. That received fertilizer every year, that didn't. But you can see that by allowing those root systems to get down, to create organic, to get everything going, it's a marked difference. So if we look at that, your effective soil depth there is there versus an effective soil depth down here. Your effective soil depth is 3 to 4 times deeper. Soil fertility and soil analysis, most nutrients here are 50% higher than there, even though we fertilize here quite a bit. And we can go into what's happening there later. Carbon at this sort of level here, 4 times. 4 times higher than the carbon content, which equates to roughly double the water holding capacity. The water infiltration rate here was 10 to 16 times faster than this side, which if you look at that into effective rainfall on a medium type slope, you're probably getting 90 to 95% going in there, with maybe 50% going in there. So if we now look at the water reservoir, which is that water available to the plant root system, you've got double the water holding capacity. It's 2 to 3 times deeper. You've got double rainfall effectiveness. That can be 8 to 12 times larger for that plant to access when you go through a dry spell like we had here. And I think the next slide will show that. If we look at Natal, January going through to January, this is your from October, November through to March, April. And we look at the rainfall pattern, the red line, the green line is your average of rainfall pattern. And you can see in this January, February drought, it's dropping off quite a bit, but we do have excess rain earlier on. Now, this is your critical growth phase. If we are able to build up that soil reservoir and have the roots deeper to get down and utilize it, we start making a massive difference here. This could be your 1, 2, 3, 4 times difference in yield, especially dry land, especially in that dry area. So if we look at economics goal, what we're trying to do, we're not necessarily trying to increase your yield, this is performance versus input costs. What we're doing is we're trying to reduce the cost. But if you take this on your farm, you get a curve like that, and it's based on 5 different phases. First, you've got your foundation, where you're setting up, you're getting the biology going, things like that. Once that, your soil's right, the fertilization, once that foundation is laid, then you start seeing very high return on investment. So in this zone, you spend $1,000, you get $5 back. The foundation, you're spending money, you're not getting all back, it's in the central phase. Then you get to optimal, which is where we should be aiming. And when you get to optimal, if you look at this, the profit margin, they find that in fact they're even better than here. Too often we're trying to go for that maximum yield, and now never get the maximum yield, our costs are going up quite considerably. So our goal is, that's here. Then if you look at that with the break-even line, if you've got an excellent foundation versus a poor foundation, your poor foundation, your profit margins are really small. There's very little margin of error. Whereas with a good foundation, which costs more to establish, suddenly those things change quite a bit. And that's where we are focusing attention, is getting that foundation and early stages going, and as a result, getting up towards that bigger foundation. And just showing the importance of the cumulative effect, and just brought that back. It might take 2-3 years before you start seeing big results. In some cases, you get extreme cases where you see results straight away.
Jana, let me confront the pioneers again. That's my job.